You know, what if everything we've been taught about femininity, about love, about relationships is just fundamentally wrong? That's the really provocative question at the heart of one of the 20th century's most controversial spiritual texts. So let's dive right in.
So here it is. We're going to be deconstructing Osho's The Book of Woman. Now, this is a work that promises to, shed light on the very essence of what it means to be a woman, tackling everything from sex to politics. But, and this is a big but, to even begin to understand the book, you first have to understand the man who wrote it and his, let's just say, very challenging ideas.
Okay, this quote right here, it gets right to the heart of his whole philosophy. Osho's argument is that the male impulse, that need to analyze and solve everything, that's exactly where we go wrong. Not just with women, but with life itself. He basically believes some mysteries are meant to be lived, to be experienced, not just picked apart and explained.
All right, so to really get a handle on what he's saying, we've got to start with the man himself. Who exactly was Osho, and what was his goal with a book like this?
Okay, so his birth name was Chandra Mohan Jain. Osho was an Indian spiritual leader who became, world famous, and in a lot of circles, pretty infamous. He founded the Rajneesh movement, and his whole philosophy was built around things like meditation, love, and creativity. But the thing that really shook up the establishment, it was his incredibly open, radical views on human sexuality. I mean, that's how he earned the nickname the sex guru. The guy was a fierce critic of pretty much all tradition. He took on socialism, Mahatma Gandhi, organized religion, you name it. And all of that really sets the stage for his views on gender, which were just as radical.
All right, so with that in mind, how does Osho actually explain the conflict between men and women? See, he doesn't just offer some simple advice. No, he gives a full-on diagnosis for what he sees as this centuries-old sickness, and he traces it all back to one single ancient source.
For Osho, it all boils down to one crucial point. The entire history of conflict between the sexes, it comes from a deep, fundamental male insecurity. Think about it. A man can't create life from his own body. He is completely dependent on a woman for the species to even continue. Osho claims this created a profound inferiority complex, and that's what drove men to dominate women in every other way they could, socially, politically, and physically.
And this core insecurity, he says, shapes two totally different ways of thinking, two different psychologies. So on one hand, you have the male psychology, which Osho says is rooted in a need to dominate, to analyze, to control. But on the other hand, you have the female psychology. He says it's inherently connected to that life-giving power, and it expresses itself through nurturing, experiencing, and this capacity for a much deeper, more spiritual kind of love, not just physical desire.
And the fallout from this dynamic? Well, he argues it wasn't just personal. It became systemic. Osho's view is that for thousands of years, society itself has been engineered by men to crush the very qualities that make women powerful. Things like their intuition, their emotional depth, their unique wisdom. And this oppression, he says, hasn't just wounded women. It's wounded everyone, men included, very deeply.
So, if that whole historical foundation is broken, what does that mean for our most personal institutions? The ones we live with every day. Well, that brings us to Osho's absolutely scathing critique of modern love and, especially, marriage.
And yeah, Osho pulls zero punches here. He sees marriage not as some sacred bond, but basically as a social and legal contract of ownership. He calls it an unnatural institution where you make promises about how you're going to feel in the future, which he thinks is completely impossible. For him, marriage is simply the place where love goes to die, because it swaps freedom for obligation.
He actually maps out what he sees as this inevitable downward spiral. First, it starts with biological attraction, right? Just a temporary chemical thing. Then, pretty soon, routine and predictability set in and just kill the passion. That leads to resentment, because both partners feel totally trapped by these promises they made. And then finally, in his really bleak assessment, that resentment just festers and turns into this mutual hatred, where the home itself feels like a prison.
Okay, so if marriage is the problem, then what about love itself? Well, Osho argues that what most of us call love, especially inside these structures, isn't love at all. It's just a power game. He calls it a lower form of connection that's really about politics, the politics of control, of possessiveness, of jealousy. It's not a state of being, it's just a constant miserable negotiation.
So after all that, pretty heavy diagnosis, right? Osho does offer a prescription. He lays out what he sees as the path forward, a vision for what he calls true liberation. And it is probably not what you're thinking.
And what's really interesting here is that Osho was actually super critical of some forms of feminism. He believed that when women tried to get their freedom by just imitating men, becoming more aggressive, more competitive, more analytical, they were missing the entire point.
No, for Osho, real liberation was an inward journey. It wasn't about looking outside. It was about turning away from that masculine model and rediscovering the authentic, true feminine nature that he believed had been suppressed for centuries.
So what does that actually look like in practice? Well, for one, it means embracing qualities like softness and grace instead of aggression. It means rejecting any idea of revenge against men for past oppression. And this is crucial. It means understanding that nobody is free until everybody is free. In his view, men are just as trapped in their roles as women are. And finally, it means unlocking a woman's unique potential, especially her spiritual and sexual energy.
And this is where Osho connects the physical directly to the spiritual. He argued that because women are capable of multiple orgasms, their whole sexual experience is fundamentally different from a man's, and potentially much, much deeper. He literally saw the orgasm as a gateway, a moment where the ego just dissolves, a glimpse of total bliss, almost like meditation, that connects a woman directly to her creative power and consciousness.
So, starting from this idea of individual liberation, Osho then expands his vision way, way out. His thinking was, if our relationships need to be completely reinvented, then society itself has to be totally restructured from the ground up.
And he starts by asking a question that, let's be honest, is still pretty radical today. What if the nuclear family, the very bedrock of our society, what if it's an outdated and actively harmful model?
See, for Osho, the family unit is a main source of our psychological issues. He saw it as this institution that just forces rigid ideas, prejudices, and all sorts of limitations onto kids. It basically stifles their natural curiosity and their individuality before they even have a chance to figure out who they are.
So what was his alternative? The commune. He imagined these communities where kids weren't the property of just two parents, but instead belonged to the entire community. The idea, he argued, was that this would free them from the possessiveness and the specific biases of a single family and let them grow up with way more freedom, more love, and a much wider range of positive influences.
So, at the end of all this, we're left with a really challenging question, aren't we? Osho's entire vision is built on this idea that men and women are fundamentally, essentially different. And he believed that embracing those differences, not trying to erase them, is the only real path to harmony. But does that risk just reinforcing old, tired stereotypes? Is this a revolutionary path forward, or is it a dangerous step back into the past? I'll leave that one for you to decide.